You are 34 years old. Last Sunday, Ethan stood in your kitchen holding a beer he never even opened and asked whether he could crash on your couch for a few weeks. I feel awful having to ask you this. Would it be okay if I stayed here for a little while? Of course, you answered. Stay as long as you need. 9 years earlier, you and Ethan had finished school in the same month, sent applications to the same companies, and landed your first serious jobs inside the same office tower, only a few floors apart. He was the one who received the promotion first. He was the one who claimed the corner workspace before you did. At the reunion, everyone kept saying Ethan was the person destined to make it big. Then last Sunday, he was asking to sleep on your couch, and you agreed, before he could even finish explaining why. The gap between your lives was never about ability. It was not about your paycheck either. The real difference came from something you began doing when you were 23. It was such a minor, repetitive habit that anyone watching you would have assumed it meant nothing. You practiced it quietly every week for an entire decade and never told another person about it. This is the story of how you stepped away from the race everyone else was still running, and how nobody realized you had already left the track until there was nothing left to catch up on. Go back. You are 23 again. You have your first place, a job badge hanging around your neck, a parking spot, and a bank account finally carrying your own name instead of your parents'. Every 2 weeks, money lands there, and about a week and a half later it has vanished again. Not because you are careless. You cover your rent, buy groceries, and go out with coworkers, because that is simply what people do at that age, and every choice feels perfectly sensible in the moment. You never stop to calculate everything and think something is wrong. You only have the vague feeling that the balance never truly rises. It just keeps shifting from one side to the other. In April, your first raise arrives, an extra $260 each month. For a short time, it feels like you have finally moved forward. Then that increase quietly disappears into slightly pricier shopping trips, a forgotten subscription fee, and the fading excitement of progress. Each year you put in more effort, yet somehow you end up standing in almost the exact place where you began. The cycle happens so often that you stop recognizing it as a cycle. It simply becomes what having a job feels like. Nobody pulls you aside one day to explain this hidden rule, so you have to figure it out on your own, just like most people do. Whenever your income grows, your definition of what feels ordinary expands right along with it, almost invisibly. The apartment that thrilled you at 22 starts feeling like a temporary stop you should have moved beyond by 24. The car that once felt completely fine begins to look embarrassing when parked beside the vehicles your coworkers drive. None of these choices seem outrageous when viewed one at a time. Every purchase has an explanation, every upgrade has a reason. But when you step away and examine the last 4 years all at once, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. There is a name for it. Your lifestyle absorbed every raise before any of that extra money had a chance to build something meaningful. Ethan, meanwhile, appears to be doing everything right. He leases a vehicle that makes people glance over in the parking lot. He is always the person suggesting the most expensive place to eat, always seeming like he just returned from another trip. People talk about Ethan the way they talk about someone who has already figured life out. You do not resent him for it. You simply assume, almost automatically, that he understands a secret you have not learned yet. This is the point where the conversation becomes important, because almost nobody explains this clearly. At 25, you genuinely cannot tell the difference between someone who has built real financial strength and someone who has become very skilled at funding the appearance of it. From the outside, the evidence looks almost identical. The vehicle looks the same whether it is fully owned or whether the payments continue for several years beyond what the person can comfortably afford. The dinners look the same whether they come from accumulated savings or from a credit card balance that quietly gets worse month after month. Much of your 20s are spent believing visible spending is proof of invisible stability. That happens largely because nobody ever taught you what actual security looks like. Real security, by its very nature, does not need to make an announcement. The event that changes your perspective does not arrive feeling like a life-changing event. It is simply an ordinary Thursday. Your manager stops by your desk, tells you the quarter went well, and mentions that a small bonus is coming your way, $750. You expect to feel something close to victory. Instead, you feel almost nothing, and that emptiness bothers you more than disappointing news would have. That evening, for the first time, you calculate a different kind of number, Not the expenses for this month, not the goals for this year. You look at the entire span of your working life and arrive at a figure that leaves you staring at the screen. If nothing changes, you may spend another 35 years repeating this same routine. And when that road ends, there is no promise that you will have anything to show for it beyond whatever happens to surround you in that exact moment. The idea does not terrify you. It simply settles in, heavy and quiet, following you around for several days. A few weeks later, you finally speak with an older man at the office who you have watched walk by for 18 months without ever truly noticing him. He is approaching retirement. He drives the same practical sedan he has relied on for what feels like forever, moving through life without the rush or anxiety everyone else seems to carry. One day, you ask him with a half smile, almost joking, how he manages to stay so calm all the time. He pauses, considers the question, and answers with something that takes a while for you to fully absorb. There is a world of difference between buying things to convince people you are doing well and actually building a life where you are secure, he says. Most people never stop to figure out which one they are chasing. Then he simply returns to his coffee, as though he did not just say something capable of changing the way you view the next decade. That evening, you sit down and honestly calculate everything you own. The final number is lower than you hoped, and seeing it written out stings a little. But instead of closing the computer and pretending you never looked, you make a choice almost nobody around you is making. Starting with your next paycheck, before covering the apartment, before spending on anything optional, a set amount will be transferred somewhere that is not easy to reach. It is not a dramatic sum. In fact, it is so small that you barely feel the difference in your routine. It is almost funny how insignificant it appears when you first set it up. You schedule it automatically because you already understand something important. If the decision is left to your future self on some random evening, that version of you will discover a completely logical reason to postpone it. You do not try to rebuild your entire life overnight. You do not eliminate every little pleasure or turn your existence into an endless budgeting exercise, because you already know a miserable plan like that rarely lasts. Instead, you guard this one contribution the same way you would protect a bill that must be paid, while allowing everything else to continue almost unchanged. After that, you write down a date on a small piece of paper. It is the point when, in theory, you could become financially independent if you keep following this habit and let the money grow untouched for years. You fold the note, place it inside a drawer, and tell no one. You do not quit your job. You do not make some dramatic announcement about transforming your life. You simply begin putting yourself first, quietly, while everyone around you assumes you are still standing in the same place as before. On the surface, that is true. Then 18 months pass. You are now 25, and something subtle has shifted, even though you cannot easily explain exactly what it is. You stop chasing the promotion that demands longer hours and brings more pressure. You stop bringing up your title as if it still needs to prove your worth. At a friend's birthday dinner, the conversation reaches the familiar question that moves around the table. So, what have you been working on? What comes next for you? Two people at the table have genuine answers. Big changes, a new home, and a different future waiting ahead. When the question finally reaches you, you give the safest answer. Everything is steady. It is true, but it also means almost nothing. You notice a few polite expressions appear around the table, the kind people make when a response does not really spark excitement. The discussion moves on within about 5 seconds. Driving home afterward, you feel something you cannot quite identify. It is not jealousy, and it is not really about money either. It feels more like watching everyone else continue sprinting while you quietly stepped away from the track. A race you once chose, on paper, to stop running. For nearly all of your adult life, your job title has been the answer you gave whenever someone asked who you were. You willingly removed that answer, and you still have not found a replacement that feels natural. What you do not realize yet is that this exact discomfort, intentionally becoming someone who looks ordinary from the outside, is the hardest stage of the entire transformation. And somehow, you have already survived it without noticing. By the time you turn 28, the relationship between you and Ethan has quietly changed without either of you ever sitting down to discuss it. One Monday morning, he parks his car beside yours. He looks at your practical old sedan, and the expression on his face is not arrogance. It is concern. "Are you actually okay?" he asks. "I mean financially. Are you really okay?" You tell him you are fine. He gives a slow nod, the kind people give when they are not completely convinced but decide not to push further. Later that same week, during lunch, you accidentally hear two coworkers talking about you while they have no idea you are nearby. One of them says you must be quietly supporting your relatives because that is the only reason they can imagine for why your life appears unchanged. You do not correct them. You cannot, at least not without opening the door to a story that would take years to explain. All the automatic transfers, all the choices, all the sacrifices nobody ever asked about. So you finish your meal quietly and let them keep whatever version makes the most sense to them. Let them underestimate you. You begin to understand something important. Being overlooked is not an unfortunate side effect of this path. It is almost the entire structure of it. Turning 30 becomes the most difficult year, and almost nobody warns you about this part. You are making the right decisions, yet somehow it feels heavier instead of easier. There are no cheers for progress that happens slowly and privately. Your closest friend buys a house and shares the photos in the group chat. The keys are there, the sold sign is there, the proof of a new chapter is everywhere. Within an hour, 18 people have already responded. You type a congratulations message, erase it, then write it again because you truly are happy for him. At the same time, you quietly recognize that you cannot reach that milestone yet, and maybe you will not for quite a while. That night, you pull the small note from the drawer one more time. The finish line still feels impossibly far away. You have spent 7 years following the rules, doing everything you were told would work, and the only evidence sitting in your hands is a scrap of paper hidden in a drawer and a figure you cannot proudly show off to anyone. For the first time, an unwelcome thought starts creeping in. What if everyone who doubted you was right? What if you traded your best years for a spreadsheet that nobody will ever care enough to see? That same year, the market takes a rough turn. For a few months, the number you worked so hard to grow actually shrinks, and somehow, that hurts more than watching it stay unchanged. You begin checking it far more often than before, even though every glance makes things worse. Each update leaves you feeling a little smaller. A quiet part of you considers stopping the automatic contributions for a while, even briefly, just to feel like you still have control over something in your life. You keep them going, not because you feel certain, but because you refuse to give in. Years later, you will understand that the period when it seemed like your entire strategy was collapsing was actually just the ordinary cost of building something that takes time before it starts paying off. By the time you are 32, everything gets challenged at once. On an ordinary Thursday, your company announces layoffs. Before lunch is over, half the office floor has disappeared, and you are among those leaving, along with Ethan. Standing outside with a cardboard box in your hands, you run the numbers again, but this time there is no curiosity behind it. There is urgency. The savings you built are real. Those 9 years of small, repetitive, almost boring transfers are still there. They cannot support you forever, but they can buy you breathing room if you defend them instead of draining them. So you make a choice that hurts far more than you expected. You move back in with your parents for a while. You sleep in your old bedroom and give up the trip you had finally allowed yourself to start planning. The embarrassment is strangely specific, deeply personal, and difficult to explain. That first night lying there again, the date written on that little note suddenly feels farther away than it did when you first put it down. For a moment, you seriously wonder whether the plan was ever going to succeed at all. Still, you refuse to empty the account. You do not create new debt just to make your situation appear better from the outside. You choose temporary discomfort over borrowing your way out of it. Ethan handles losing the job differently. He keeps the apartment. He keeps the car. From the outside, for a long time, it genuinely looks like Ethan is doing better than you because he never has to return to his parents' house and never appears to struggle in front of anyone. What you only discover much later is that he was quietly paying for that appearance. A new job he accepted out of fear and a growing pile of debt were holding up the image that looked so stable from the parking lot. He was never truly ahead. He simply appeared to be. For a while, that illusion was convincing enough to fool everyone around him, even himself. You return to work, but this time you move at your own pace. For the first time in your life, you have the freedom to wait for the right opportunity instead of accepting the first offer just because the next rent payment is approaching. Then, gradually, something shifts. It is far quieter than anyone would expect. A flat tire becomes a small task to handle rather than a disaster. A difficult boss becomes someone you can leave behind instead of a prison you have to endure. Time stops feeling like a countdown constantly hanging over your head. The date written on that little note finally arrives on an ordinary Tuesday, and you almost miss it. There is no celebration, because no one else even knows that date mattered. That afternoon, you simply check your accounts, quietly realize you crossed the boundary you promised yourself you would reach 12 years earlier, and start making dinner like it is any other night. And that brings us back to your kitchen. The previous Sunday, Ethan sits on your couch with an unopened beer, asking how you managed to become the person who is doing okay. Your mind returns to that small note from 12 years ago. You remember the moment when your answer disappointed people, the coworkers who assumed you were struggling, and the bedroom from your childhood where you nearly abandoned the entire plan and considered telling everyone the truth. Now you see it without the heavy emotions that once surrounded it. You did not arrive here because you suddenly earned a dramatically larger salary or because you were smarter than everyone else at the office. You reached this point because, quietly, when you were 25, you decided what success meant to you, and you refused to let someone else's scoreboard pull you away from that choice. The race most people chase does not truly end when they become wealthy. It ends when they stop performing for an audience that was never paying as much attention as they imagined. Ethan was not the enemy of this story, and he was never really your opponent. He was simply running the only race he had ever been shown, the visible one, the one with a scoreboard anyone outside could understand. You were fortunate, or perhaps stubborn enough, to stumble into another kind of race, one without a scoreboard, where the only person keeping track is you, and where winning can look almost identical to standing still for many years. Maybe you made that choice long ago, and you are already farther ahead than you realize. Maybe you are still standing at the edge, telling yourself there is plenty of time left to begin. Either way, nobody will recognize the exact moment when you start. That is not a flaw in the plan. That is the entire plan.